Good afternoon, and welcome to Blueprint for Clean Energy, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Rohini Mukherjee, and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Geli, Solar Plus Storage, Why 1 plus 1 equal to 3. As many of you know, the Blueprint for Clean Energy webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of clean energy to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in corporate, nonprofit, and public-private arenas. Each webinar is recorded and available from CBay through YouTube and on the Yale iTunes channel. In this webinar, our speaker, Andrew Krulewitz, the Director of Marketing and Strategy at Geli, will explain the economic drivers of behind-the-meter commercial energy storage technology in California, as well as other state markets. How do these systems work? What is the business case? All of this and more will be explained. Our presenter, Andrew Krulewitz, leads marketing and corporate strategy at Geli, a provider of end-to-end design and automation software solutions for the energy storage industry. Prior to his time at Geli, Andrew worked as a consultant with Ford's electric vehicle division and as a market research analyst at GTM Research, a subsidiary of GreenTech Media. Before we begin, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have and will direct them to our speakers towards the end of the talk. Please type questions directly into the Q&A window throughout the presentation. And with that, Andrew, welcome to Blueprint for Clean Energy.
Thank you very much, Rohini. And thank you all for joining. I'm very excited to be here today to speak with you about the economic value proposition of combining solar PV and battery energy storage for, in particular, commercial customers. Rohini told you a little bit about my background, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Geli. Some of you may be familiar with us, some of you may not be familiar with us, but Geli is a provider of software solutions to the energy storage industry. The best way to explain what it is that we do in a context that is immediately recognizable, I imagine a majority of you are watching this webinar on a computer right now. If you happen to be using a Windows-based computer, it could be made by any number of companies, whether it's Dell or Lenovo or Asus, but they all have one thing in common, and that's that they use Microsoft Windows. So similarly, in the growing energy storage industry, you have a lot of companies making batteries, you have a lot of companies making power converters, making various other system components, and Geli's aspiration is to be the software platform that connects all these different components to provide energy services to different types of customers. So with that being said, let's talk about energy storage more generally. What you see on the screen in front of you here is what I colloquially refer to as the Rocky Mountain Institute Wheel of Storage. And so if you're just casually interested in energy storage as a technology, I highly recommend that you seek out RMI's report on energy storage. It was released last year or the year prior, but it includes this figure, which discusses all the ways in which energy storage, and in particular battery energy storage or electrochemical energy storage, can be used to benefit electrical infrastructure or electrical customers in some way or form. And the way this is broken down is on services that a utility can make use of and how they can tap resources that include storage. And so in this case, on the outer ring, they have the different end beneficiaries of the storage service. Then they have the individual types of service just inside that outer ring. And then on the inner rings, the light pink refers to customer-sided energy storage or small batteries. The middle red ring refers to distribution-sided storage, so somewhere on the wires between the customer and the large energy infrastructure. And then the bullseye, the dark red, refers to storage that's sited at a power plant or at a large transmission facility. For today, what we're going to be talking about are behind the meter services. And so these are different applications that an end consumer of electricity would be interested in, and the most basic of which is backup power. If your lights go out, the battery turns on, lights stay on. The second is PV self-consumption. So for various reasons, charging the battery off of solar is something that is attractive to folks, and I'll discuss why later on, and that's an application. The third, and the one we'll focus on most today, is demand charge management. And demand charge management is otherwise referred to as peak shaving. And finally, time of use shifting, very simple application. Charge the battery when energy is cheap, and then use the battery when grid energy is expensive. So now that we've settled on behind the meter customers, we'll talk about what type of behind the meter customer. So there are residential and commercial industrial customers who buy from a utility. It could be your grocery store, it could be your parents' home, could be your home. And then of course there are the utility itself and their potential customer storage as well. Today we won't be talking about residential customers. I'll just say briefly that residential storage is growing in the US, but the value proposition is not significant enough for it to proliferate like distributed solar PV has. And we also won't be talking about utility-sited energy storage. Now, these are very different types of systems, and there's good resources out there if you're interested in learning more about those. But what we'll talk about today is commercial and industrial-sited energy storage. This is the main market driver here in California for behind-the-meter energy storage, and we see growing demand in states like New York and Massachusetts. So what types of energy applications are these commercial customers after? Number one is demand charge management. As I mentioned before, demand charge management refers more generally to peak shaving. So if you have a building that consumes energy in short bursts, how do you mitigate those peaks of energy and power demand? And then the second is PV self-consumption. So many commercial or industrial or municipal customers like schools want to install solar PV as well to reduce their energy costs. And there is a significant synergy with energy storage, and we'll cover that later. What we won't be talking about today, as far as energy applications go, is demand response or frequency regulation. And so these are both things that batteries can and do, and I'm sure many of you have seen examples of this in trade press like Green Tech Media or Utility Dive. Demand response has a program that is a form of program that has existed for a long time. In its most basic form, a demand response provider will get a call from the utility saying, we need you to drop load, and then they in turn have a phone tree and they call a lot of big energy consumers and they turn off equipment, and that's demand response in its most simple form. Batteries, however, can provide load drop as well. If a utility needs spare capacity, these batteries can turn on and they can provide capacity to the grid without affecting customer operations. So that's why demand response is attractive, an attractive option for batteries in terms of not impacting customer operations, but the revenue from demand response for batteries is fairly low these days. And then the second is frequency regulation. So in some markets, such as PJM in New Jersey, the ability for a battery to help maintain the frequency of the grid is one that is or was highly valued for a few years, but a lot of batteries were built in the market, and actually it was the first kind of boom bust cycle in energy storage we saw just last year. So in sum, we'll be talking about demand charge management and PV self-consumption, and we will not be talking about demand response or FR, but if you do have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And finally, what does one of these projects actually look like? They are not all that exciting, to be honest with you. So this is an example of a system that Geli is automating in Southern California. There are two battery stacks here. One is for just demand charge management, and one provides backup power. You can see there's a lot of associated electrical infrastructure. Building an energy storage system is not straightforward and easy. And as the industry starts to grow, I think a lot of installers are discovering this. It's not as straightforward as solar. And folks expected, because there's a big incentive in California, we should just see lots of energy storage going in the ground. And while development has certainly picked up, it's by no means a well-oiled process. So on the right, you see the physical system. On the left is an example of our software. If you work in control rooms, this should look somewhat similar to you. If you don't often work around electrical infrastructure operating systems, this may seem a little strange, but all those lines represent something different on the screen. And in particular, I can break down what you're looking at here. So if you see where the green line is, and that is the total consumption of this building, actually the building that I just showed you, the green line refers to the peak building consumption. And in this example, it peaks out around 140 kilowatts. And then if you look at the purple line, I'll take that away and then look again. That is the peak load after the solar plus storage system has been installed and the Geli software dispatches the battery when the solar is not bringing down the load. And so the Geli system actually reduces peak load by about 50% in this case through smart management of solar PV and energy storage. And that is really the goal of 95 to 99% of commercial industrial energy storage systems that are being integrated into buildings today that aren't just for off-grid use. So why would people be interested in clipping their peaks? That's a great question, and one that I think a lot of people may not necessarily know the answer to, which is why we're having this webinar. So if you think about the energy bill that you all might get, either at your home, at your apartment, at your office, just a regular office, a small office, it's typically only comprised of an energy component. How many kilowatt hours, how many units of electricity did you consume over a fixed period? And here in front of you, we have a very simple example of a load curve. So if you think about that graph left to right as one day, you wake up in the morning and your energy peaks when you're making breakfast and getting ready to go to work. And then you come home at the end of the day and your energy peaks even more because you're making dinner, you've turned on your TV, everybody's home, the lights are on. And for a majority of energy consumers, they're only billed on the total amount of energy that they consumed. For many commercial customers and industrial customers, large consumers of energy, utilities also often charge a demand component, which is based on the peak kilowatts used in that same billing period. And the best way to describe this is if you have a bathtub and you're filling up the bathtub, two identical bathtubs will hold the same amount of water. So if you're being charged on volume of water, like being charged on volume of energy, you would pay the same. But if one bathtub slowly filled up just with the tap dripping and the other one had the tap wide open, one with the tap wide open would pay a much greater demand charge because of the amount of volume in a short period that they require. So why do commercial industrial customers care about demand charges? They already go solar, and that cuts a significant portion of their energy use. Well, it's because these demand charges have been consistently going up. And here, what I've plotted in front of you are demand and energy charges for the most common commercial and industrial tariffs amongst the three California IOUs. And so demand charges are plotted in green and energy charges are plotted in blue. And what you'll see here is that energy prices have stayed relatively flat over the last 10 years for commercial customers in California. But demand charges have done anything but. you can see that the green lines are going pretty steadily up and to the right. And to give you a sense of what these cost, energy is priced on the right. So commercial energy rates in California typically hover between 10 and 20 cents, although there's some new time of use rates coming out that go into the 40 and 50 cents for peak time. But demand rates, which are priced on the left, have started around $15 to $20 per kilowatt per month, and now are trending upwards of $40 per kilowatt per month. And when you consider an entire bill, it can make up almost half of a commercial energy customer's bill. So that being said, let's jump into it. The meat of this webinar, which is a case study talking about a customer who is located in the American Southwest. So this actually isn't in California. So I'm going to show you a project that works without any subsidy beyond the investment tax credit. And I think that's really interesting because it should underscore the fact that energy storage can work in many more places than just California or other high cost markets with subsidies. And so the customer that we'll be talking about today is a hospital in New Mexico. We'll be modeling a cash deal, or for the purposes of this webinar, don't assume any project finance has come into play. It's as if this hospital will have bought the system outright. And what I've got in front of you is what the customer currently pays for energy and demand. Their energy consumption is significant, but relatively inexpensive, only 4.1 cents per kilowatt hour. That is very, very cheap. A fraction of the cost of what we pay here in California, where Geli's based. The demand is also significant, over a megawatt peak demand, which is it's a hospital, it's a big facility. And they pay, on average, $23 per kilowatt per month. And I say on average because in the winter months, when AC units aren't ramped up, demand costs are lower, and in summer months, they typically are higher. And if you look at the total charges, the kilowatt hours of the kilowatts multiplied by the respective rates, they pay about $250,000 for each component, for a total bill of just more than $500,000. So for this customer, they really care about demand charges. Demand charges comprise more than 50% of their bill. So why is it that demand charges do comprise more than 50% of their bill? We're going to look at a number of images like what you see in front of you to explain just that. So on the left, this is a real load profile for this facility, so a little bit different than the cartoony one that I showed everybody earlier. And you can see here that on this day that we grabbed, I think it was a March day, the peak load is about 850 kilowatts. So it's not the max peak that I talked about over a megawatt, but it's pretty high. And so if you think about this daily load profile, and then you stack 365 of them on top of one another, you get your image on the right. And so what we're looking at on the right is a year's worth of load profiles. And instead of seeing them from the side, you're seeing them from above, with peak load being red, hot, or white, and low load being blue. And so from left to right on this graph is 24 hours, and from top to bottom is 12 months. And what you can see here is that in June, July, August, and September, that building is really, really red, and in some cases white. I see instantaneous load of more than 1.3 megawatts. And that are the hottest months in New Mexico. And so that makes sense. And they have air conditioning load and whatnot. And you can even see breaks for the weekend. So if you look very closely, you'll see those red stripes. And in between those red stripes, there are very clear weekends. Now, I don't know why a hospital get any less busy on the weekends, but it's an image that we believe is a very clear and easy to understand representation of how a building consumes energy. So now that we know what this customer consumes and how they consume it, how might a project developer seek to reduce their energy bills. And I mean, there's many different ways you could do this. You could do LED lights, you could do HVAC efficiency retrofits, but today we're talking about solar and storage. And so I'll just juxtapose those two and then see how they come together. So if you were to install only solar on this facility, they would only address the energy needs of that customer, the kilowatt hours, the total amount of consumption that they have. And at this facility, there's a max size of 500 kilowatts. And we'll assume that the turnkey cost is $2.50 a watt. The other option is to install energy storage. And we determined that a 250 kilowatt, 270 kilowatt hour energy storage system would be the ideal system for this facility. And the turnkey cost on that is $1,300 a kilowatt hour. Some of you who maybe keep up on energy storage news will say, hey, that's really expensive. Well, even though the actual physical system can be had for $500 to $600 a kilowatt hour these days, there are significant costs associated with actually building and commissioning that system, as I mentioned earlier. And so what we see is an average of 100+% a cost increase beyond just the hardware, at least right now, as the industry matures. And then finally, what if we install both solar and storage at this customer site? What if we combine that 500 kilowatt PV system with a 250 kilowatt energy storage system? And we'll talk about the implications of that. So solar addresses the energy, storage addresses the demand, and together we'll see how the results will play out to be either better or worse than the individual components. So let's talk about installing solar only. Here again is that same day. I said this image would come back. And on the left, what you're looking at is the gross building load, what we already saw before, left to right, midnight to midnight. And you can see it peaks around 850 kilowatts. And if you look at the right, this is what that load profile would look like once that 500 kilowatt solar system is installed. And you can see the sun starts to come up around 7 a.m. and it starts to set around 4:30 p.m. But during the middle of the day, solar hollows out a significant portion of that building's load. And that yellow shaded area equates to the energy that the building will have saved or netted out against their utility consumption. And something else I'd like to point your attention to is that green box, a little hard to read, says PV demand reduction. And so you can see that before PV, the peak was about 850 kilowatts around 11 a.m. But with PV generating, the peak actually comes down to 750 kilowatts around 4 p.m. Now, this assumes that the solar is generating, that there's no clouds or anything like that. But for all intents and purposes, PV here is providing about 100 kilowatts of demand reduction. What does this look like on an annual basis? On the left, you can see that the baseline facility Fingerprint, like we discussed before. In the middle is what that solar production looks like. So this is a new image. You can see here that it produces the most in the summer months. You can see a time change there for daylight savings. And when you look at the two together, you can see that solar really hollows out that building's load in the middle of the day and provides a significant amount of demand reduction. I apologize for the small text on all of these subsequent slides. I pulled this from an old presentation. It's got our old color scheme. So if you wonder why we switched from red to green, as the marketing person, I am embarrassed, but time was tight. But the content is what is key here. So if we look at the economic outcome of the 500 kilowatt PV only system, you can see that there will be energy savings of about $40,000 a year. Compared to the do nothing scenario. And there is potential for up to $31,000 of demand charge savings. So the total savings could be between $40,000 and $70,000. Now I say there's potential because solar may not always be generating. You may have that cloud. A squirrel may have chewed through some of the conduit. Who knows? There's any number of reasons why solar PV may or may not be generating. So that is why typically these days, third-party owners of solar, people selling solar, do not say you should expect demand charge savings. They can only say you expect energy savings of X. Sometimes they'll mention demand benefits, sometimes not. So the outcome on the solar system, the payback is 6 years. which is still pretty good considering that the prevailing energy charge was 4 cents. Excuse me. IRR, 12%. It's got a positive NPV. We did assume that they would take ITC and bonus depreciation, and we'll talk about ITC later, the investment tax credit. All the assumptions are right here. All right, well, let's talk about energy storage alone. So again, here's this baseline graph. And on the right is what the effect of a 250 kilowatt energy storage system would be on that load profile. You'll notice that we've introduced a new little graph below the load profile on the right. That is the battery state of charge. And you can see that it goes from 100% almost down to 0% and then charges back up. And in this case, over the course of the day, the battery is discharging to mitigate peak load and then recharging when the load subsides in the afternoon. And so the battery takes it from about 850 kilowatts to 800 kilowatts. Now you're saying, well, it's a 250 kilowatt system. Why does it only take it down 50 kilowatts? Well, when the battery acts on its own, it has to address peaks over a very long period of time. And this is only a 1 hour energy storage system. And so it's got a 5-hour peak window here. And you can see that if you've got 5 hours of energy, you're delivering 50 kilowatts, that's 250 kilowatt hours, which is about the capacity of the battery. So batteries on their own really aren't that effective at reducing peaks for facilities that have a load profile such as this. If there's one spike in the middle of the day and everything else is flat, could be good. But with a load that is this general bell shape, batteries are not actually all that effective at reducing demand charge costs. Here's the facility fingerprints. What you can see here is that there is minimal effect on the load. Like we just saw, the battery brings down some of the peak load, but not all that much. And that being said, it does provide significant demand savings, about a 10% reduction on their demand component of their bill, 5.2% overall, the demand savings of $27,000. Now, keep that number in your head, $27,000 storage only demand savings, because it's going to come into play later. How does this energy storage system perform? Without taking the ITC, it does not qualify for the ITC. The payback would be 7.5 years with a positive NPV. But this isn't necessarily a slam dunk project that I think a healthcare CFO would be willing to put his money behind. What about this combination? Solar plus storage, the third option. Here we'll walk through our graphs again. You can see that we have our standard load profile on the left, peak load around 11 a.m., about 850 kilowatts. In the middle, we have our solar production's effect on the load. And now what's new is we have the effect of solar and storage on the load. And there's some key changes to how storage behaves here. The first is how it's charging and discharging. Before, if you looked at the state of charge graph on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you'll remember that the state of charge graph was more like a U or a trough, because it was 100% discharged during the day and then charged in the evening. But when you pair solar and storage, this is where PV self-consumption or solar self-consumption comes in. Most people will choose to charge the battery off the solar. And so here, you can see that the battery actually is a parasitic load in the morning. It charges on the early morning solar generation, and then it discharges that energy in the afternoon hours. And if you think about each individual component's demand reduction capabilities, like I said earlier, PV brings down the peak load about 100 kilowatts. And before, storage brought down the load only about 50 kilowatts. But now, because the load profile has been augmented by solar generation, storage is more effective in reducing that last bit of demand in the evening. So whereas before it only brought the peak from 850 to 800, now it's taking the shoulder hour peak and taking it from 800 down to 700 kilowatts. And so this doubles the effectiveness of the energy storage. What does this look like from a facility fingerprint point of view? The first image is no solar storage. The middle image is with the solar generation overlaid. And then the third image is with storage. You can see that the red and white is slightly reduced in the third image, and it's kind of hard to see with the Geli watermarks. Apologize for that. But I think the real image that you want to take away from the benefits of solar and storage together is this one on the right, where you can see the load in profile and understand how it all works. What does this mean in from a savings perspective? Here we'll compare solar only, storage only, and solar plus storage. So the solar savings in this case doesn't change, between solar only and solar plus storage. And in some cases, however, there might actually be a slight variance between the two, depending on the battery charging and discharging efficiency losses and whatnot. But like I said before, what we need to pay attention to here is the demand savings. So in the solar PV only scenario, if you look at the demand savings, you could realize between $0 and $30,000 in a year. If you move to the right and look at the demand savings for storage alone, you see that it's $27,000. But if you go all the way to the right to demand savings for solar plus storage, you can see that combined storage is more than twice as effective as it was with either individual component contributing to that demand reduction. And that is where we get the idea of 1 + 1 = 3. In this case, you may be saying, well, that's only really 2. 1 + 1 = 2. That's not very clever, Andrew. But I'll get there. I promise. So if we consider the financial outcome of this system, cash payback, no project finance. Payback is, I'll just jump to the main point here, is the payback is the lowest for solar plus storage. And here I'm plotting the three key metrics. Solar only had a payback of 6 years. Storage only had a payback of 7.2 years. Solar plus storage has a payback of 5.4 years. Solar plus storage has the highest project IRR, and solar plus storage is more than double the NPV of the other two projects. So here's the 1 + 1 = 3. We have to do some math to get there. If you add the NPV of the solar only and the NPV of the storage only, it gets you to about $400,000. But if you look at the combined NPV of the solar plus storage system and how its operations are synergistic, you see an NPV of $600,000. And so, 4/6 divide by 2, you get 2/3. In this case, 1 + 1 = 3. Bit of a stretch, but point is, solar plus storage has significant synergistic benefits when it comes to the financial outcome of most of the systems. One thing that I should note is that the solar plus storage system did assume that we could take, or the owner could take, the 30% federal investment tax credit on the energy storage asset. So there have been some private letter rulings, including many detailed by Deloitte, which is where I got this graph. Energy storage must be deployed with new solar PV systems, so it can't be a retrofit, at least not as we read the rules. And it must charge from at least 75% on-site solar generation. And so if you install a battery in an energy storage system and you don't charge the battery a minimum of 75% from the on-site PV, then you don't qualify for any of the investment tax credit. If once you cross that 75% from PV threshold, the ITC increases pro rata with the percentage of solar energy stored at the facility. Generated at the facility and stored at the facility. So if you only charge from solar, you're 100% ITC compliant. A lot of people think that if you install solar and storage together, you can save money because you're going to be leveraging similar labor, similar components. That's actually not really the case. As I mentioned before, energy storage is still in its infancy, and systems are not all that straightforward to put together. Even if you have a standardized battery power converter kit, somebody might want it. Some customer might want it in a basement storeroom. Some other customer might want it, outside right next to the building. Some other customer may want it a half mile away. And you have to run all the wires and communication means out there. So really the cost can vary significantly. There's two main ways in which people can seek to actually build an energy storage system coupled with solar. This is a little bit more in the weeds, but it's interesting to think about. And I'll actually like to start on the right. So if there are any solar customers on the call, so any home solar customers, listeners who have a system on their house, if you wanted to put in a battery, in most scenarios, the solar generation would flow directly into your battery. It would not have to be converted to AC power and then stored elsewhere in your home. You just do it directly for efficiency purposes. So that's called DC coupled solar. It's the most efficient way to move electrons from solar energy to a battery. And for residential applications or microgrid off-grid applications, that is the most popular choice. But for commercial and industrial systems, a majority of these are AC coupled, meaning that the solar is converted to AC power, and then if it's being charged by the battery, it has to be reconverted to DC power to be stored. So there's an inherent efficiency loss there compared to the DC-DC conversion. And the reason for this is that typically the solar array is much larger than the battery, and you would need a really, really large power converter, and the system layout wouldn't be all that feasible because the solar array is on top of the building, the battery is typically in the basement or outside, and that causes some headaches around making sure you are only charging from solar when you're ITC compliant. I see we have some questions rolling in here, and so we will get to those. But first, I want to talk about what makes for a good solar plus storage market. First, this is really the solar component, is you need retail rates in excess of 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That may need to go up because of the trade tariffs, which may be handed down on panels, because of tax implications around the ITC with the new tax bill should it pass. But right now, if you're developing solar, 10 cents a kilowatt hour, if it's above that, it's probably a good opportunity. Typically, you want net metering to be available, meaning that the utility will credit back the excess solar production at the retail rate. And then demand charges. So you have to have demand charges present for energy storage to really be a viable option, greater than $12.50 per kilowatt per month. For listeners outside the US, I would add 30% the value of the ITC to all three of these numbers. But we do see opportunity for demand charge management with solar in places such as Australia and Mexico as well. So what states in the US present energy prices that are conducive to developing solar? California is one. It's the leading solar state in the country. Hawaii is the next, although those islands are oversubscribed with solar, and it's caused some havoc on the grid. And then finally, the Northeast has significantly high energy charges in many different utility territories, but of course, solar resources there aren't what they are in California or Hawaii. What about demand charges? Where are demand charges present? California is also the leader in demand charges, so that plus our state's generous storage rebate makes this the leading commercial market. Interestingly enough, Nebraska has a lot of demand charges. That's because of the significance of rural electric co-ops there, or municipal co-ops. They have a structure in which they amplify and pass on demand charges from their regional transmission operator. And then New York and, interestingly, North Carolina are also states with a lot of expensive demand charges. And that is the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to field questions. And so I'll turn it back over to Rahini to moderate those out.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Andrew. It was indeed a great presentation. So we will now be opening up the webinar for our Q&A portion. Once again, just a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them through the webinar's question menu at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is, and I know, Andrew, you briefly touched upon this through your presentation, but one of the questions is like, it seems like the ITC is a big part of some of these assumptions. So does the solar plus battery storage combination make sense in a world without an ITC? If you can expand on that a bit.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. And then I think really the way that we should frame that is, does solar alone make sense in the world without ITC? Batteries as a standalone asset have lived in a non-ITC environment for quite some time now. So the way we view it is, if the ITC were to go away or become economically unfavorable because it'll be double taxed at the government level, or whatever that kind of poison pill is in the tax bill, storage is that much more valuable, right? So solar alone may not present the same payback that it did before, and with energy prices staying relatively flat, storage can add significant savings to the top line. And also, that drives the bottom line for the project. So we think that, if anything, loss of ITC is bad for solar, but not necessarily as bad for storage.
Great, thank you so much. And this provides a good background for our next question. This is a more broad question. So what do you think, what's the future of battery technology, and where do you think is the next innovations in this space?
The future of battery technology. So I have to be upfront with everybody and say that I am not a technologist or a scientist by trade. I'm an English major with an MBA, so probably not the most appropriate person to comment on that. But here's what we are seeing. Lithium ion is the dominant technology today. And the reason for that is it is the most widely produced, and the costs have come down incredibly. 5 years ago, the average price for a lithium ion module was around $1,000 a kilowatt hour. With the advent of a lot of electric vehicles and consumer electronics, we can now purchase batteries at $250 a kilowatt hour for just the module, just the battery itself. And systems have come down from $2,000 a kilowatt hour for the whole box with the battery and the power converter and the software, down to around $500 per kilowatt hour. And so because of these price declines, energy storage is becoming a viable option in many different places. That being said, there are other technologies out there. Solid state batteries are in their infancy. There's been a lot of companies trying to commercialize flow batteries. A lot of those companies have gone bankrupt. And they hold promise for significantly cheaper energy storage technologies, but the flow batteries and similar technologies, they lack the power density of lithium ion, and they are not as proven. So there will certainly be advances, but in the immediate future, you can expect 99% of capacity to be lithium ion.
Great, makes sense. So the next question is, can you discuss how Geli goes about finding customers and clients? Can you talk a little bit about the process? Do they approach your team, or how does that work exactly?
Sure. So we here at Geli provides just the software. We don't actually approach end customers. We leave that up to our channel partners. So we work directly with solar project developers, energy services companies, to help them sell energy storage systems. The primary means by which we do this is actually an automated web application. And so Geli has a tool called Geli eSyst, and we have about 1,000 project developers who use this tool to size energy storage systems, to find the optimally sized system for a customer. Every customer is different. Every load profile is different. Every tariff is different. Every solar system is different. And so within reason, you need to be able to change the size of the energy storage system, excuse me, for maximum financial impact. And there's actually a question that came in about the healthcare study I went through, and one of the listeners says, was a 250 kilowatt battery the optimal size with regards to the financial outcomes? In that case, it was not actually the optimal size for storage only. It was optimal for solar plus storage, and we just left it as that size for storage only. But so back to the question about how we sell our software, developers come in, upload all their customers' energy data, and our software tells them what size battery would be the most economically viable for their customer site. And then we predict what demand and energy savings we can provide them over the life of the system if they were to use our automation software, our software that actually controls the batteries when implementing that system.
Okay, great. So one more question which one of the attendees has is, does the storage have to be at the same facility as the solar? So for example, can you pair solar with larger or more centralized storage?
There's a lot of additional questions I would have to ask, but the way to think about it is for a commercial system, for a system on a customer site, as long as it's all behind the same utility meter, then yes, you can do that. They don't have to be physically co-located, but they need to be behind the same meter. So a good example is Geli's actually doing some work here with a college in California, and they're putting in a couple megawatts of solar and a megawatt hour battery, and they're nowhere near each other, but that's okay because they're behind one meter for the entire college, and it has something like a 5 megawatt load or something. It's huge. And so in that case, it's totally fine.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming up. So the next question would be, how do you calculate the demand side potential savings?
Well, that's our web application. We have our demand charge management algorithm that we develop for runtime environments, meaning when there's actually a battery installed, and we take that and we run that over a customer's load, and we see what the potential demand savings would be with all the different types of systems that we can automate. Our partners have small systems, big systems, and we simply find the one that's most cost effective. So you could reduce a customer's demand charges to zero with a giant battery, but that may not be the most cost-effective option. It's usually somewhere between 10 and 30% that's most cost-effective.
Right. So shifting gears a bit, one of the questions is about your background. So if you can talk a little bit about your background at the Green Tech Media, and also your shift into the battery side of industry. Like you mentioned, you have a completely different background, a different academic background, and then your journey has been into the really interesting one. So can you share some of your background and talk a little bit about how you made this shift?
Absolutely. So I was very fortunate to work at Green Tech Media's market research team, GTM Research, and there I covered the growth of the distributed solar industry here in the US. So that's both residential and commercial and industrial. And what I learned was really about the market drivers, how the development process works, project financing, and those I found translated directly to my current role. But what was the real main difference was I was moving from just a market research, market analyst position where all I had to do was collect information, synthesize it, and understand it, to actually making use or making actionable the data and insights that I would have been collecting before. And so the reason that a lot of these skills transfer to storage is that storage has developed very similarly to solar PV. A lot of the same companies who develop solar are now developing storage. The business model is generally the same. A lot of these systems will be owned by a third party. There's different finance structures, and the development process of securing incentives, permitting, signing customer agreements is almost identical. So it's just really the technical information that I had to learn once I stepped into my role at Geli.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very interesting. So diving back into storage and inverters. The next question is, do you utilize inverters that enable future solar integration?
So for some commercial systems, they are installed with multi-port inverters, which means that these inverters can charge from and discharge from to and from various sources, either on the DC side of the bus, meaning without any efficiency losses or minimal efficiency losses, or on the AC side, which is the type of power that would be consumed by the building. But generally, most inverters are the one that does the job and nothing more. I mean, these are cost-sensitive operations. We're trying to drive out as much cost as possible. A multi-port inverter for a commercial customer is significantly more expensive than a simple two-port inverter, which is AC coupled to solar. Now, most residential systems are plumbed for direct integration of solar. Some of our partners, company called Tabuchi that we work with, they're saying install storage first, and if you want to install solar later, you can. It's all about efficiency in manufacturing. Residential inverters are much easier to manufacture, and so having separate tooling for two-port and multi-port inverters wouldn't really make sense. Bit of a complicated answer, but so I guess the answer is sometimes we do.
Okay, great, thank you. So next, diving into the policy side of things, are there any policy changes that need to be made to make the solar plus storage method more successful or utilized?
Yes, there could be a lot of policy changes that would really help the storage industry and the solar plus storage industry. But really, what needs to happen is there needs to be a fundamental shift in how utilities themselves view distributed resources. And we're seeing some interest and action in this. If you think about Southern California Edison, they have contracted with a number of companies to provide behind-the-meter storage for grid support in load-constrained areas, meaning that there's not enough transmission to get the power to the load. And so if you put a bunch of batteries in, you can help relieve some of that congestion. And if regulators were to force utilities to think about non-wires alternatives, meaning instead of just building more transmission and power plants, how could we solve local infrastructure capacity issues with local resources, clean resources, would that cost less? And if there were a forcing mechanism for every utility to do just that in the US, I think that would be a huge boon to the industry. So the answer there is mandatory non-wires resource consideration for new transmission build out.
Right. The next question is a very important one from the customer's point of view. How much does it cost to use this technology? And of course, is the size based on the project? And can you please expand upon that a bit?
So I assume this question refers to Geli software.
Right, yeah.
So our site analysis tool, the one I mentioned to help people understand the value of energy storage, is free. Anybody on this webinar can go sign up. Don't sign up with a Gmail address though, because you get rejected. You have to sign up with a professional email. There's a demo in there. You can see, just use some of our basic data to play with the tool. Now our automation software is what we charge for, and it does change based on the size of the project. The more batteries you have, the more power converters you have, the more potential savings there are, means that the more we're going to charge whoever is paying for that system. Now, end customers don't typically license our software from us. It is sold through as a part of the system, the whole energy storage system itself. So, when you buy a Mac computer, you don't pay Apple separately for the software. It just comes with it. And so similarly, when you buy an energy storage system from one of our partners, you don't typically pay separate amount of money for our software. It just is included.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, so we have to wrap up. But just a question, so these slides would be uploaded in our in the Blueprint webpage, but is it also, and these will be recorded, but in some of the audience had the question that if it would be possible to share some of these slides. So is it possible for Geli to share some of these slides publicly?
Absolutely. Let me direct you to the original deck that I presented with Rocky Mountain Institute from last year, which is a little bit more comprehensive, and I'll have that uploaded for the group, and they can use that one.
Okay, that's great. So with that, we have to unfortunately wrap up today's talk on Geli solar plus storage, why 1 + 1 = 3. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. It was indeed a great presentation. We also want to thank the Blueprint audience for all your questions, and we will forward any remaining questions to our speaker. To view a recording of this webinar, please visit the Events tab on the Yale Center for Business and Environment website, or access the recording through the Yale iTunes University podcast. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, this is Rohini Mukherjee from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, signing off. Thank you.